Yeah, so we can start with 100. I can maybe just give like a quick overview of the intent of this proposal, and then we can go through the details as if there are questions, and you guys can have it on your screens as well. So for 100, this is the net zero energy path for Denver Green Code. So basically, this proposal would allow for an off-site path, off-site renewable path, as long as it meets certain exceptions. So that is, I can zoom in, I'm sure that's probably necessary. What you're seeing on this screen here, all these modifications are addressing the off-site path addition to the Denver Green Code. And then there would be a separate document for rulemaking. I don't think we need to go into this in detail, but this is something Christy, Eric, myself, and Sean from NVI and Johnny from CASR gave input on. This would allow you to do the off-site path if you meet these exceptions. So we're not saying you can choose the off-site path over on-site. You have to be able to meet exceptions to be able to do the off-site, understanding that you do want to promote that on-site is more beneficial for projects. So I can go into a little bit more detail if you want me to zoom through this.
And so I'm going to take a step back and just ask a question related to this process and how you guys feel about it. Like, as we're going through these, I know I personally did not have an opportunity to look at these this morning and refresh my memory on what's in these proposals. The intent of these conversations is for us to get to a point similar to where we would get through the hearing process, where we're totally good saying we're going to move this forward or not, but say that we are going to move this forward for adoption. So in order to do that, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at these thoroughly too. I know that when we sit in the hearings, there are different minds that have been looking at the language. If you have concerns as we're going through this and we say, yeah, we're giving it the thumbs up, I just want to make sure that we all talk about that. And because this is not like it feels kind of squishy, like the informal conversation, but like these would still go forward. So we want to be sure that we're happy with the language in there. And if we need to add some extra layer of process or something onto this, then let's keep it in mind and make sure that we mention that when we talk with Eric about where we landed.
Yeah, good point, Christy. I mean, this is our first, we haven't had too many discussions prior to this meeting of how this process would work or what's best for us getting to that conclusion of what should we move forward. So certainly open to suggestions on how we even do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be critical that we're all for this process, and just like the code committee hearings, for us to have good conversations on this, we all need to be sort of ready to discuss the concerns that we see in front of us. I do think that having Eric bless our decision is going to be needed. I think absolutely.
Yep.
But yeah, so I mean, just diving into this proposal, the one comment I had, I mean, everything looked good to me. This is commercial only, correct? This is just applying to commercial buildings? Or is this intended to be residential as well?
Good question.
No, it doesn't necessarily exclude residential, although it is.
It does, because the energy chapter in Denver Green Code for residential is chapter 4 and chapter 7 is commercial projects only.
Okay, so is there a similar proposal for residential, a mirrored proposal?
There's not.
Okay.
So Denver Green Code, we are not offering pilot paths for residential projects. And although there's no reason why we wouldn't have a similar proposal for residential projects anyway, but I'm going to say that because this is the zero net energy approach, well, not because of that, but because we are offering pilots for commercial projects, but not for residential, if we miss having this written in for residential, it doesn't break anything. It's just a missed opportunity.
Okay. And then section 701.6.1. Oh, and I agree. I agree with what you guys just said. But yeah, 701.6.1. Prior to the issuance of a building permit, submitted documentation that the design is capable of achieving net zero. To me, that all that language appears to be captured in the above in section 701.6, where it's, building shall be provided with on-site annual renewable energy production no less than the annual energy used. So the building is calculated in accordance with section C407. Systems renewable calculations demonstrating meets the requirements of this section shall be included in construction documents in accordance. So it seems like we already have the documentation for the design captured in 701.6. And I don't
Agreed.
see the need for that additional section.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think we made that just so much more detailed than the last version. So I guess the proposals to strike this out
Yeah,
here.
I move to amend,
A second. All right, I should be tracking, so there we go. One thing I did want to bring up was, and this came up in conversation more recently, is the ability for wind source to be used. Currently that is in the minimum renewable code proposal, like number 4 for commercial. And I think it belongs there. It gives projects more availability to be able to do offsite, as well as meeting, they have to do 2 out of 3 things in the base proposal. In the Denver Green Code, I don't think that's the right solution to allow wind. It doesn't necessarily get us to our goals that we need to meet. But for offsite solar, there is more availability, more capacity coming online for that. And I think if you're going down the Denver Green Code path and you're doing offsite, you should be held to a higher standard than the base code. And so in talking with Johnny and Kasser, the language I would propose to add would be specifying is built for that customer program in lieu of is dedicated for that customer program here. I can zoom in a little bit. So I would propose that we're switching dedicated to is built for that customer program, which wouldn't allow wind source to be an option for the Denver Green Code net zero energy path. I just want to open that up for discussion.
Yeah, it's tough for me. Like, I'm not sure that I fully understand exactly how much Excel is building of what in response to the community and where the excess capacity goes, or if they don't, like, to me, it's just a big pool of capacity that Excel is working on, and it's a mysterious pool of capacity. If this triggers more offsite renewable capacity to be manufactured and brought online for Denver than the other approach, then we're accomplishing something by doing it. And so I could support that by saying, sure, I guess, as long as Excel's not responding by decreasing how much they manufacture or how much they bring online, if the community brings more online. Like, it's a little fuzzy to me. because Excel is looking to complement what the community needs, you know, and they've committed to meeting 80% of needs. But what does that mean? Like, I don't think I fully understand what that means. Is it 80%? Like, how are they quantifying what that 80% is constituted by? Do they revisit that number year over year to see what Denver's needs are this year versus what they were last year? I would assume that they do. So then if I have my own offsite solar that I've instigated to be constructed for my project to serve my project, does that take it out of the need that Excel is building? So have we just effectively decreased what Excel has to build? So it's like an equivalent benefit? I'm not clear.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Christy. I don't believe that's the case. I don't think that would be subtracted from what they're already planning to build.
Yeah, if I understood correctly from our meeting with Johnny yesterday, it was basically Excel has their renewable energy mandates that they have to meet. And then so if you, Christy, say, I want, you know, a certain amount of megawatts for my project, that they take that out of the, I guess, out of the pot that they're using for their renewable energy requirements. And then so they transfer it over to your pot, and now they have to put more in that original pot to meet their renewable energy goals. So it's not just like an accounting thing where they're moving pieces around, but it actually, by you taking some out of that original pot, it encourages and incentivizes or spurs them to develop additional renewable capacity.
So are they looking each year at what Denver's needs are to get to that 80% number and changing their capacity each year? Or do they have a designated capacity that they intend to build that they've identified in 2022 for 2030 to meet that goal of 80%, which seems a little sketch?
I don't know the answer to that, Christy. I would have to check in with Johnny and how they're evaluating that.
Yeah, we could only assume, but Johnny was speaking to us about what, you know, like he has information on what Denver's total energy use, you know, like our community electricity consumption is, and then what, you know, what Excel is providing from a renewable capacity. So it is being tracked by someone. I don't know. Yeah, we can't speak to all the models and projections and plans.
No, but it would be relevant to how this question gets answered, because I hear what you're saying about how we think Excel is reacting when somebody builds offsite solar, but I'm not I'm just going on faith that you're telling me that that's how we think it is. What you're telling me doesn't actually tell me how that's happening.
Right, yeah, I would have to check in with Johnny on that to give you a better answer.
Because that would affect my opinion on whether or not we want to make this more stringent. Because why would we do that? Why would we put the onus on a building owner as opposed to letting them draw from the pool like everybody else? It depends. Like, we've got to understand what we're accomplishing. Because if we're just taking burden off of Excel and transferring it onto individual building owners and making it more difficult for them to pursue zero net energy, then that's a little strange.
Right, I don't think we would be transferring from Excel to owners. I think it would be more of the wind source capabilities. The RECs are just a bit different. So there's more of like unlimited capacity, which doesn't help get us towards our goals, like offsite solar through Excel does, or through Solar Gardens. Which is why there's limited amount available, which is why I'm proposing that for the Denver Green Code, because the wind source doesn't, and Johnny can speak to this better, and I should have pulled him into this meeting, so I apologize, but it doesn't help us get towards our goals the way it's set up. So,
but it has to. If Excel's saying that they're meeting 80% of the need with renewably sourced power and they're using wind, like, that helps us get to that Denver goal. Like, they're relying on wind to get us to that Denver goal.
They are structured differently, the way wind is set up versus solar. And again, I wish I could speak to that in more detail. I can't. So maybe we take a pause on this portion of that and pull Johnny in for the next conversation.
I mean, are there other opinions? Am I the only one hand wringing over this?
No, it's interesting questions because usually everything is benchmarked off a certain year. So when Excel says they're going to be 80% renewable by 2030, is that using projections of what they expect the total demand of Denver to be at 2030, or is that using what the current demand is that'll be 80% of what the current demand is? And how does that get adjusted each year? It's a good question because almost all of the other energy goals are based off of a benchmark year of some sort, like 2005, 2012. So yeah, and I think it would only be fair to not put the onus on an owner if it's giving Excel a benefit.
Mhm.
So I agree. I think it'd be some clarity would be beneficial.
Okay. So maybe Johnny can join us for the beginning part of, if he's available, of the meeting in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'll try to get that. I just pinged him now. I have a feeling he had an 11 o'clock meeting now. But he'll be able to answer your questions in more detail, and I apologize that I cannot.
So looking at the next sentence, the code official may request copies of the contracts to verify compliance. It's sort of an awkward sentence that's just hanging out there. Should it be 1.2.3 and just bring it into a correct section?
Yeah, I see your point on that. I don't see why we couldn't do that.
Just the way it's hanging now is it's hard to see where it applies or how it applies. Yeah.
So I had a question about 70162. I'm fine leaving it as it is. It was more just a question. Within 24 months of the issuance of the CO, we need documentation showing that for 12 months, the project is functioning as a zero net energy project as intended, which means that they're always going to have to target lower. But the way that I've seen this requirement written in some other regulations is that it's within 110%. So it allows for that swing that can happen. I'm okay not allowing for it. It just means that they're going to have to, in order to succeed, they'll have to shoot below the bar on their energy use to make sure that they come in compliance. So I will take quiet to mean that we should just leave it as it is. I'm not adamant either way on it. It's just a little bit stricter than what I've sometimes seen in the past.
Well, that's a good question, and I honestly don't know how, if we should. I mean, I think it's a good idea to give a little bit of buffer. And what happens if they don't meet it? Like if we don't give a buffer and they don't meet it, what does that mean?
Yeah, what's the penalty? So right now there is no penalty. And since this is a pilot program provision, we wouldn't need to have a penalty in place yet. And but this does tie to our conversation about outcome-based compliance and what we're going to do when people don't meet their outcomes. For the pilot program, Scott and I had talked about this, and I'm okay to just continue the thinking from a couple of years ago. A pilot program project team is probably going to be giving it their best effort and trying really hard. We didn't have penalties if they failed. You know, if they checked the box on LEED Platinum and they couldn't get to Platinum, or they checked the box on Zero Net Energy and then they failed to perform, we didn't think that the incentives were big enough. There's nothing to take back. Like, we're not going to charge them their $50,000 back from the reduced permit fee, and there's nothing to take back on expedited review. We didn't think that the incentives were so lucrative that teams would abuse the program. We felt like it was good intentioned teams coming in and trying to do the right thing. And so if something went wrong, we'll let it happen. And if it gets abused, we'll adjust in the future. However, we will have to talk about that, you know, between now and 8 years from now, because we will have to have reliable outcomes at that point that aren't on the honor of the team.
Chrissy,
Yeah,
if I had a quick question too. Things are always going to change. People buy houses and do these modifications. You know, they start doing these changes, and how are we going to assure that we meet that at 12 months? So I'm actually a proponent for making sure that we do. That's the first thing that we see in the field, is that people move in, all of a sudden they've got different air handlers, do all kinds of different things in air conditionings, and they're changing things in the house. They don't always know the compliance path.
So this would be for commercial projects, and it would be within 2 years they have to show that they hit the goal. If a developer, I think we have a provision in here, and I would have to go back and look at the admin section, but I thought we had a provision here that stated that if a developer sells a property, they have to disclose Denver Green Code involvement related to that property. And the same would be true for residential. We talked about that for Loretto Heights, because they are utilizing the Denver Green Code to gain extra height on some of their projects. And there was a whole bunch of conversation about that, because they have to, you know, it was the conversation around, so what happens in the future, not in 6 months, but 6 years, if somebody comes along to one of the homes in Loretto Heights that was Denver Green Code compliant, will that homeowner who does renovations be beholden to the current version of the Denver Green Code, or the old version that it was?
Or do they have an option to go to the board and say, hey, you know, I don't know. These are just some of the things that when I was reading it, saying, can we go to the board and say, hey, I don't want to be part of this anymore? How do we handle at that time? Because they're going to flat out say, city, what are you going to do about it?
Agreed. And we didn't come to resolution on it. So there was definitely conversation about it. Michaela was part of that. And again, this is just going back to Loretto Heights. For the commercial buildings, the goal is to get to Zero Net Energy within 2 years. And then we don't have follow-up for the life of the building. So that's, you know, if they want to go crazy after the second year, they hit Zero Net Energy within 24 months, and then they go crazy, they can. We didn't put anything in place for ongoing maintenance of that goal being met. And this goes back to the conversation about shifting to outcome-based compliance and outcome-based inspections, and making sure, and we're not there yet as a building department, but we know that we've got to get there, and we have 8 years to get there. So it's imperfect, and it highlights the imperfection, but right now the goal is just that single benchmark of within 24 months, we can show that they hit the goal.
Thank you. I appreciate you answering that. Lastly, I would say, if there's something that we can do for these guys to give them incentive to follow through, because this is a big deal for us. So I don't know if there's any type of incentive that we can offer for them to continue, other than their savings that they're already getting.
it's a good idea. And I guess, Courtney, I would look to the CASR team on that. And if that's something that you do want to incentivize for existing buildings, because right now, existing buildings don't fall under CPD purview in that way. And we also don't have a climate protection fund to incentivize anybody with.
Fair point. Yeah, that's something we can put on the list to look at as when we're looking at the climate protection fund, what makes sense to put dollars towards. And this could definitely be one of them, especially because we don't anticipate 30 projects going down this path. So I can take a note on that.
Do we need to specify who the documentation goes to at this time? And I guess my second thought is going to Christie's original point of 110%, I would almost vote, say, since there's no penalty now, leave it at 100, just leave it as is. And then when the documentation gets submitted and we can see how buildings are performing in real life scenarios, we can maybe adjust next code cycle and give the buffer when it's a requirement or when the performance outcome is actually mandated.
I agree. If there's something in here where we're only looking at 110%, it becomes their new target of how do we meet 110% or 90%, I guess, the opposite. And then we're not getting the real information that we need, especially if there's no penalty at this point. I welcome this. I feel like we've done a pretty thorough conversation. This isn't something that I'm saying we need to vote on right now, or however voting works in this scenario. I'll ping Johnny to bring him in for the conversation about the offsite portion. But I'll save this and we can pick this up on next time. Does that work?
Yep.
Sounds good.
Right. The next one, I believe, is 62 air barrier. So I've saved copies, Christy, so I'm not modifying the original, by the way. So this is 62 around air barrier testing. And I apologize that I'm not going to do a great job at explaining the details of all of this. These were written by NORESCO. So hopefully in the future meetings, we can bring NORESCO into these conversations. We'll have to address that in our scope of work with them so they can give a more thorough explanation and answer some of these questions of why is it this way and things like this. But in general, the overall intent is to clean up language around air leakage testing. I can zoom in a little bit. It was helpful when I was looking at this to review the kind of 4 different areas of modifications within this proposal. So for C402.5, and we can maybe go up here. I noted it starts to clarify that you just have to do the air barrier testing. It seems like this language gave you an option of what to do when you don't do the air barrier testing. So that was this modification here. And then jumping down to C402.512. Language was added that, but saying that it does apply to R, group R and I, so that it's not saying including, but that it is that include R and I. I'm not sure if that's 100% clear that that's the intent, but that was what was written why this was changed to make it more clear. And if anyone wants to jump in as I'm going through some of my notes, you're welcome to. C402512 also and here so that testing is always required. So that's why this is deleted. Then jumping down to C402513. It was removed from the code. This is how you would comply without testing. So you wouldn't need these anymore since testing is always. So in summary, that is what this proposal intends to do, clarify the language and make testing a requirement and not give options. Want to do testing.
So I guess my first and biggest question on this is, I mean, they deleted a lot of the references in the code of how to construct an air barrier that meets, that will pass the performance test. But so it's all based on the performance test. So it's kind of an all or nothing. And I guess my question is, what happens when they don't pass? If they don't pass, is there a penalty associated with that? Is there, or do they need to do destructive remediation of the envelope to be able to pass the air barrier test? And I just have concerns deleting all the, to me, useful information of how to construct an air barrier.
I had the same thought. It scares me. I understand the intent is to rely on the testing and so, you know, not to fall back on a bunch of prescriptive things that might not result in what we want and to say that's okay. So I get that, but it's guidance and teams currently do quite poorly with air barrier testing and air barrier performance. And I don't think that it's because of assemblies, but on the flip side, like I think it's because of transitions and details. But on the flip side, I also don't think that all architects in the community currently understand how different materials perform. And like, I think that if we went out into the community and asked architects about some of these materials that are listed here, they would have no idea how those perform relative to air passage. So I agree with the point. Like, I don't want it to be an exception that if they do all these things, then they don't have to test. And I recognize that that's how those things got included into the code, but is there a, like, I'm not sure how to include all of that stuff while still requiring testing. Because it's just guidance at this point. And I know the code isn't written to provide guidance.
Well, I think we could do some inspections along the way to just make sure that those are met. I mean, even if you look at, you know, table 402411 and some of the things that are required, I know the city, and I brought this up with, you know, Paul and Todd, I know we don't do that inspection, but if they're going green, maybe that's something that we need to look at. Are they properly sealing that? Is everything meeting the code that we lead them down the right path and not down a rabbit hole?
Well, but it's, we're so far down the path at that point because they're constructing, like, they would want to know during the things that I would hope that we would look for in the field would be the transition details, but the assemblies themselves should be performing. I don't want them to have an inadequate assembly that's going in, because to discover that during construction would be a big deal, an expensive thing. So I do think we can be doing more inspections along the way to make sure that their transitions are going in properly and not waiting until they fail their air barrier test at the end to say all of your transitions stink. But this is guidance on their basic assemblies.
Yeah, honestly, I think I would move to leave the materials section, leave the assembly section, because they're still covered, and then maybe remove the building envelope performance verification, because that's used as kind of that's used as a compliance path in exception or in item number 3 of C402.5.1.2. And so that way we have the materials in the assembly section to help guide our design teams here in Denver.
And we lost
Chuck,
Courtney.
I'm going to voice in there just kind of the same thing you were saying, but we're putting the onus on that point that they're following it all. And again, if they fail at the end, how are we going to catch up? I mean, what do we do at that point?
I think it's a great question because our current code has kind of a path for remediation that's non-destructive and easily accomplished. But at the same time, I know we're trying to get more stringent than what we had on the previous code because we're trying to get the current code is to get people used to testing. And now we're going to require testing and it's a pass fail, but I think we need to provide a clear path if they fail, what's next to help you guys as inspectors in the team and help the design teams and construction teams as they're trying to pass these tests.
And the challenge is what that path is. We've had quite a bit of conversation about this, or I have with Eric, and we've struggled to land on something that we can reliably use. I think we had some conversation about, well, so we looked at a paper that was written by Dwayne Johnlin out in Seattle, and he talked about this. And basically what he said is in Seattle, 50% of contractors completely disregard air barrier testing because there's no penalty if you fail. And 50%, it's raised consciousness for them, so they're doing a little bit better or doing well. And so that made us believe what you said, Chuck. We've got to have some sort of penalty other than just saying go test, because 50% just ignore it, the please go test. But when we tried to figure out what the penalty would be, we started with, here's a good idea, let's have offsite solar offset it. But it's not that simple, because now we have a whole bunch of renewable energy requirements that we are proposing to add to the code, which makes it impossible for some project teams to utilize that if they've utilized those the on-site and off-site solar in other ways. If they fail their air barrier testing, they may not be able to purchase what they need. There may not be capacity, so there was concern about there being capacity. And it's tough to figure out how we would apply that. I mean, I think we were first saying, well, we'll just do a macro stroke by building type and size and approximate, and how fair is that? So if we could even get that fair, we couldn't rely on that alone. So then the second idea that I floated out, which is probably not where we're ever going to land on anything, but it was the only thing that I could come up with that we could implement this time, and we're not doing it now, was an outcome-based alternative. So the same way the Green Buildings Ordinance has the Green Building Fund, where if you just can't do any of the 8 options that are listed for you on site to meet the requirements of the Green Buildings Ordinance, you can pay into the GB fund, and then the city will use that money to go build green space someplace else. So you have met the requirement because the community is still benefiting. You just didn't do it on site. And so I was proposing that we have something similar for buildings, for building requirements. So, okay, you missed your air barrier performance requirements, so you're having a negative impact on our grid and on our energy needs. So let's propose some alternative fund that you could pay into, and then the city will pursue projects that offset that someplace else. But that's really complex. And Adam Hernandez recoiled at the idea. And so that doesn't have any legs. But I don't know how else to make it attainable for every project. Like, I'm open, I would love to know what else we could do as the penalty that would be fair and usable.
I think you're on the right path. That's great.
But we can't do that for 2022, and we may never be able to do it because, again, Adam Hernandez was not a fan of that idea at all. He was kind of like, you're just maybe off the rails. So
do you have a similar proposal that they're using somewhere else that we can present to Adam and maybe he would reconsider?
No. So that's the thing. There is not another jurisdiction that I could find information on in the US that has a penalty associated with failure in air barrier testing requirements. Seattle has been the most ahead of everybody that I can tell, and they don't have a penalty. They just have acknowledged that a penalty would be a good thing to have, but they haven't come up with a solution.
Does Seattle have a path for remediation? Like, do they, like, similar to what we had in our current code? Like, to try to fix things and retest and then have like a lesser standard they are trying to aim for, or something similar?
Good question. I'm not sure.
Okay.
So I think we're stuck with just having testing for this code cycle, but this ties directly to the ongoing conversations that we've been saying need to happen between code cycles. Like, we can't solve all of this in the year that the code cycle lands. We've got to be thinking about how we're going to transition our community to outcome-based compliance, and this is part of it. And it's going to be complex, and we may not have anybody else to follow. Like, we may have to figure things out ourselves, which is going to take a bunch of work to make it fair and workable.
Yeah, because even the alternative paths that are in the IECC, like the building envelope performance verification, that requires a design professional to be inspecting throughout the construction. So it's not like if they failed the test, they could then go to this other, because it's not possible. It's sealed, or the envelope's constructed.
Chuck, is there anything we could do about putting some of that back on the design professional, maybe?
Well, I was trying to think about, is there a way we can have the design professional revisit their energy compliance with an updated infiltration rate based on the new, knowing the leakage of the building, and require them to comply, to verify their building still complies with the code. And that may require upgraded HVAC or lighting or something other, or more renewables, or some other way to detail compliance. But that was my initial thought, was put it back on the design professional to make up the difference.
But by the time they figure it out, like, we could definitely do that. But that does get us back to that idea that it's probably going to be pretty expensive for them to figure out how to do that, because it'll be at the end of construction. So, like, an upgrade to the equipment is like they're carrying out. Yeah.
Yeah, everything's on long. I mean, the lighting would probably be already installed at that point. So doing lighting controls, advanced lighting controls would be difficult. HVAC equipment's already been on a 12, 40-week lead time and on site. So yeah, I don't know the best way to that solution. That was my initial take, but yeah, I definitely see challenges around it.
Sorry all, I got kicked off and I am rebooting and getting my files back up.
So I think where we're landing is, it's an imperfect situation that is not unique to Denver, that we have requirements for air barrier testing, and if they're not met, there's not a penalty. So not everybody's going to pay attention. But I think we have general agreement that we would like to see all of the guiding text for the assemblies and the materials included back in, because it'll just help teams and raise their likelihood of doing better.
Absolutely.
So guidance without requirements associated, or path
Well,
requirements.
so without exceptions, right? Like,
Yeah,
it was written as an exception, just taking it, so it's not an exception. It just says your assemblies have to be tested in these ways, kind of thing.
Do you think we should add back in or leave the corrective measures section that we have in our current code?
I think that's only beneficial. I mean, it makes it a little bit torturous if you fail. You've got to do something more than nothing. I'd leave it.
Yeah, especially because it requires them to provide an additional report identifying the corrective actions taken to seal leaks, which shall be submitted to us. So I think that's a beneficial headache that most contractors wouldn't want to have to go through.
Yep, I agree.
I think there's an exception in the 21 that reflects the envelope corrective measures that almost mirrors what we have in our current amendments, but I think it's a little stricter because it says it has a cap for a does not exceed. Or our current code says if it exceeds 0.4 CFM per square foot, you can use the corrective measures. And then the exception of the new code says if the leakage rate exceeds 0.4 but does not exceed 0.6. So what happens if your leakage rate exceeds 0.6? Do you have to fix it to get it back into that range? And then you can use the corrective measures. I'm not sure exactly how that works. I think this came up months and months ago when we discussed this portion. And so I'm not sure if we have, we maintain our current one, which I think is less restrictive because you can use it anytime you go over 0.4 versus a cap at 0.6. So that's, I guess, a question that probably need to discuss at some point.
No, that's a
I
good
thought
point.
it was, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that exception is new and actually mirrors quite well with what we already have. Interesting, Alan.
Yeah, but other than the does not exceed 0.6. So I don't know if that means you have to be within that range in order to use the corrective measure, or like our current amendment that says if you're over it, you can use the corrective measure, seal it up, do the smoke trace, and then write a report saying what was completed. And to me, the way it reads is does not exceeds 0.4 and does not exceed. Then you can do a diagnostic evaluation.
And Alan, that's in the 2021 IECC.
Yeah, 2021, it's an exception to 402.5.3.
Yeah.
So okay, I'm wondering why that's not part of this proposal.
Well, and the interesting thing is it's only an exception to the C402.5.3 and not C402.5.2, which is the R and the I occupancy performance testing. So there's not an exception for R or I occupancies. But it'd be interesting to know, like talking to somebody with experience actually testing buildings, if buildings fail the 0.4, do they almost always fall in the 0.6 unless there's something drastically wrong and then they're above 0.6? Like, is it realistic to have a 0.6 cap where if they exceed 0.6, they've done something really wrong and need to do some corrective measures?
I believe it is. 0.6 is like if you're not meeting 0.6, something's gone wrong. There's something going wrong. If they can't keep themselves on track to be 0.6 or better, I mean, but then we still have to figure out like how far are we willing to go? I mean, I'm saying that because I think that's easily attainable for every team, but then there's going to be the team that fails, I guess, maybe. And if there is, what are we going to do? Are they ripping their facade apart? Is that where we want to be? Are they allowed to be that egregiously bad, or are we making them rip their facade apart?
I don't know.
That's an Eric conversation.
Well, and I wonder if it needs to be not only an Eric conversation, but if they are that egregiously bad at 0.6 and above, maybe it's handled as a one-off agreement with, either Eric or with us. There needs to be a corrective report that's what they intend to do to fix it, or how they plan on addressing it, where they think the leakage is coming from, and what it would take to fix it, and how they're going to try to remediate it.
Then how would we give them leniency on that if it just didn't work? we're in weird territory.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, the enforcement, Christie, is definitely an issue. Like, I don't know what to do because they can do the corrective measures and then it's good. And it's just like, all right, well, they did what they could and that's what it is, but they're still over the parameters. And I don't know. I don't know what to do. I just know it's a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree, because if they've, how far do they have to go becomes the question. Like, if they've done the corrective measures, it didn't work, how much money are we going to make them spend? Is it a deal breaker? Sorry, go ahead.
The answer to that, I do like the exception Alan saw in the other portion of this code that doesn't apply to group R and I, but I'm wondering if we can utilize it to make it apply so that there is a path for 0.4 to 0.6. Because if there's no penalty for anything over 0.4 and a project does 0.5, their building's not any better than if we gave them something of how to fix it if they met 0.5. Like, we get better projects in the end if they don't meet it and we don't have a penalty. I'm just wondering if we can bring that language into this portion.
Yeah, I think we should leave the exception for sure. I like the exception, the way it's written, sort of better than our code, but we need to determine what happens when it's over 0.6.
Right.
And then I think we should adjust it for the R and I occupancies.
And to adjust it for the exception with that, I'm trying to figure out the right location for that. And we can maybe make a note to reference NERESCO to that code section. Would that simply be under?
I think we're going to have two separate exceptions because the requirements for each occupancy type is different. So the R and I occupancies require down to a 0.3 CFM, and then non-residential is 0.4. And so I would think the residential exception maybe goes from 0.3 to 0.5. And so probably identical exceptions, just kind of copied under each appropriate code section.
Right, Chuck. Here in this residential exception from 0.3 to 0.5, and then non-residential from 0.4 to 0.6 CFM.
Yeah.
And Alan, I'm sorry, what section was that? I'd like to be able to reference that in my comment.
C402.5.3.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, with the added question mark of what happens when they exceed. And I think we're all in agreement the materials and assembly section should also be left in the code.
This portion here.
Yeah.
Well, are we allowing it to meet the exception now?
Well, these are just guiding, this is just guiding language. There's no,
Okay.
yeah. Unless the proponent has a specific reason why he wants it deleted, and maybe there's justification to remove it, but I think it's beneficial to design teams to see what assemblies and materials are required to meet the testing requirements.
I think he deleted those sections based on the deletion of exception 3 of 402.5.1.2. I thought I read he deleted it because that's the only place that references it. So if you delete that section, what's the need for them? I do agree though that it would be helpful to have guidance for the design community, because I'm sure they look at these options. They're like, oh, we could use that, we could use this. But I think what John was saying was they don't even get to use this exception, and so we don't need to present it. I mean, it's a question to ask him. It'd be nice to have him on.
Yeah.
Just to maybe go through it next week or 2 weeks if possible. Understand if he can't, he can't. But it's, I guess that would have been one of the questions I was going to ask him.
So for me, I look at it and I see section 402.5 requires compliance with sections. Yeah, so just a little further up. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that guiding requires C402.5.1 through 402.5.11.1, and that covers the materials and assembly section.
Yeah, I agree, Chuck. I had that same note because it's a range and it includes that. And if it's not clear that we're deleting those, then there could be some confusion as to what's actually required. But I don't have an issue. I think it's helpful to have those items in there, but I don't want also the confusion of that exception 3 that's being deleted. I think that ties into those 3 sections, that if you're not testing, you could build to these, to those sections and be okay. But I think it is helpful for guidance.
No.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was originally saying. It's a little weird because it gives requirements for things that may not be being used on a project, and you don't really have to meet those if you meet the air barrier requirements. It's just guidance. So without having the exception, they're a weird floaty thing that we're putting in there where it's like, why is that there? But on the flip side, it's good for people to have the guidance because it increases their chance of meeting the requirements of the code. But I'm not sure that it belongs, like I'm struggling over leaving it in the code written that way because we're not really requiring anything by it. We're just giving useful information to people through the code, which is not what we typically do with the code.
I agree, Chrissy. Like when I'm looking at these material sections, like it's telling you the closed cell spray foam having a certain density. That doesn't mean a project has to do that. If they can pass their air barrier test without doing that, that's okay. But having these written in here without it being clear that it's guidance could cause some confusion of, all right, I have to do these things where you don't. This will help you get to that, but if you can do it a different way, it's not a requirement.
Yeah.
So if it's not part of an exception, I don't know. I'm a little.
Yeah,
I
I don't
think
know
that's
the
what
mechanism.
I mean, I don't know if these items are like prescriptive measures that saying if you put those in there that you'll likely meet the air barrier requirements. It's tough. I mean, if you're, going by code language, if you're striking that and that's the only place it's referenced, then you probably should strike those sections out. Otherwise it gets confusing.
It feels like it belongs on a website of here's some guidance on how you would meet your requirements for this code, more than in the body of the code. Because there's so many other things where we would love to give guidance, like to be able to show projects how to do it, but that's not listed in the code in every section.
Yeah, I'm okay removing it because I think it's kind of awkward leaving in there without a direct reference to it for a requirement. But I'm also fearful that we really are just putting everything on the test at the end. I mean, we've almost eliminated anything that could be required on construction documents for review. I mean, and it's all field testing at the end.
I don't like it at all. I'm really struggling over it because I'm just thinking back from my time out in private sector. Like, I'm looking at this list and I would have looked at the code saying, what about if I fully grout my concrete block masonry? Is that, I know concrete's good as an air barrier, but is the CMU good? How do I make the CMU good? Do I have to grout the CMU to make it perform? I wouldn't have known. And no internet search would have given me this. If you try to search for the air barrier characteristics of CMU or grouted CMU, like there's no rule of thumb that somebody's going to publish on the internet for you to find. And so by taking this out, we're taking valuable information away from people. That's weird. I mean, on the flip side, we are not publishing a Denver energy code. We are publishing amendments to the IECC. So a project team out there who's using the code is going to look at the 2021 IECC as well as the 2022 building code amendments. So the information is still there for them to trip over if they wanted to. It's not deleted from their path. So maybe it's okay.
Yeah, you're right. It's still present in some capacity, and I think this language, again, could be copied into a resource guidance.
It could, but the community doesn't use all the resources and the guidance. They don't find our policies. Like, the more extra things we have, the less anybody reads any of them. So I hear what you're saying, but I just don't expect people would actually use it. Because like my experience, and Alan and Chuck, correct me if you disagree, my experience is that teams don't even know what's in our policy documents. And those are things they have to comply with.
Yeah, I'm often recommending policies that could help the design professional because they don't even know it exists. They're like, oh, you can use this to get out of that. And so I would agree that they don't look at our policies at all, or most of them don't. Some do. Some that are familiar will, but a lot of them don't.
Well, and Christy, to you, I feel like you had a good point earlier where you were saying, during your time as an architect, you'd go and look at the code. I mean, maybe you're just a star student and you go and find the right answers. But I guess from my perspective, like, where is it helpful to have some of this like information or resources so that we can see the outcomes that we want to see? It almost sounds like if you take it out of the code requirements, then it is just putting it all on that testing, and hopefully we've given them everything they need to prepare for that test, but maybe not. I mean, yeah, I guess, like, where do folks go for information, or how do we prepare them for that final test if we're kind of backloading this process?
So the first thing is code requirements. And then when people get more sophisticated, they start branching out from there and doing their own research and figuring more out. But code requirements are the very first place. So I do feel like maybe because this is still living in the IECC, it's okay, because that would be the first rudimentary step that somebody would take when they look at the Denver Building Code amendments and they're like, well, why did this why did this exception get taken away from me? They'll be able to see, what the information was that was in there. Well, clearly, if that was an exception and now it got taken away because Denver is being more stringent, those things are beneficial. So I'm okay. There's not one reliable resource after the code, I guess is what I'm getting at. Once you range beyond code requirements, people are doing their own research and they're finding things in a variety of places. The commentary, however, and we're not going to this as a solution currently, but the commentary was my favorite thing in the world. And to understand so much more from the commentary. So if we had a commentary with our building code amendments, that would be awesome. But that's not something that we are prepared to do now. That would be where I would put it, actually. That would be the other place that I think people reliably would look.
Yeah, I think our policies are designed to act as a commentary, but I just don't think people really go there to look at them. But it's a good point. We've had like thoughts amongst our team, like, I wish our amendments had a commentary, just like you said, Christy, because they're confusing. Like, people don't know what the justification is to why we made that change. And so some explanation by some staff might be helpful.
Where have we landed?
And it's an interesting question too, because I know like David Wren always hesitates about adding amendments to delete stuff that just doesn't apply. Like I know there's been a couple code proposals to like delete like the tropical climate zone exceptions and different things like that. So it's more Denver specific. And I mean, the tropical climate zone left in the code doesn't apply to Denver. So do we need to amend it and add language to our amendments that add to the bulk of what we have to enforce? Or can we just leave the tropical climate zone in the energy code? And the material and assembly section has sort of become orphaned based on our amendments. And therefore, if they don't longer apply, is there any harm in not specifically deleting them?
So on that one, where I would fall with it is more in line with where Dave Wren falls with it. It falls on it where, to me, using the code and the amendments, I don't want to bother reading an amendment to figure out what that amendment is, to discover that it was just to delete the tropical zone that I would have skipped had I been reading the code. Like, because you've got to read the code and the amendments. Why do I have to read and think about that tropical amendment twice, that tropical zone exception or whatever twice? So I'm in alignment on that.
Because like, honestly, if we leave the deletion in the amendments, that means all this will be struck out in our amendments. If we don't delete it in our amendments, none of this language is even in our amendments. It's just in the body of the code, but our amendments point around it.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chuck.
So I don't know, is it, because leaving it specifically deleted, I think makes more of a statement than just pointing around it.
But does it create confusion to say you can't use the exception, but all of the things that tied to the exception are still in the code because then they're orphaned? Does that create confusion?
Absolutely will. I mean, are they required? Are they going to be reviewed to it? Is someone going to reach out and say, can I use some other alternative material? And absolutely they can, because these materials aren't required. But if you kind of have to know to look that the code, our amendments now point around those sections. So I don't know what the best answer is.
I think where I would land is me personally, and it's not like, I don't know what the right answer is. Me personally, I would probably delete all of it, have it be in our amendments as deleted, because it makes it clear that the exception isn't applicable. But you can see what was struck. And so the information is still there for people to see it. It's not perfect.
No, and I'm okay with that. Since we're not going to be reviewing to those standards, and they're not required, they're a good idea, but they're not required. Maybe it is best to delete them officially to kind of emphasize that the exceptions no longer exist and testing is it.
Okay, so I'm gonna delete this comment based on what we just said and keep it deleted in code. And still, there's still guidance out there, but not tied to requirements or exceptions. Are we good with where we're at? I know, you know, we've had the conversations about the exceptions up here. We also need to have a more thorough conversation about what happens when they exceed. So I'm not saying this is ready to be brought to NORESCO, but I feel like we're at a good place today on this. So, okay. What our next one is 74.2. So this one's for IECC, and overall it's just ensuring buildings have adequate roof area for future solar. So there's a lot of added points to this. I mean, this whole section would be new. There's new definitions. It would apply to, you know, a little bit more. IBC, occupancy groups A, B, E, M, R1, and R2. There's a lot of content here about what that would require. It would be 20% of conditioned floor area for single story buildings. And I want to still having an area no less than 20% of conditioned floor area for single story and no less than 10% of conditioned floor area for multi-story buildings on the roof. There's exceptions for 4 more stories above grade, high-rise residential, buildings that already have PV systems installed with a certain capacity, and certain shading exceptions. And then there are just requirements about what that means, what your roof needs to have to be PV ready, or not just the roof, but the pathways to that. And I took this from what should have been the final folder. There's still comments within this document that you can see from Eric and John, so that might be helpful as well as we're looking through this.
So I guess my questions are mainly around exception 1 and exception 2. Is why is there such a difference in requirements between a residential hotel building versus a non-residential like office building?
trying to see if there's any information in this body.
Because going up to 7 stories are requiring 10% of the floor area on a 6-story hotel building will mean that 60% of the roof area will need to be dedicated to PV or have a solar area. And it just seems like a lot. And then just cleaning up language, the way it says like exception 1, 2, C405.13, all those exceptions should just be exception 1, 2, and 3. And then as long as they're nestled under the correct code section.
Agreed, these are unnecessary.
Am I crazy, or should the title of section C405.13 be, it says non-residential building solar access requirement, but then some of the exceptions apply to residential buildings. So something's not working there.
Yeah. I just feel like it should say just take out non-residential. Because you're saying what groups here,
Exactly.
and some of them are R1 and R2.
I think you could get rid of building as well, just solar access requirement.
Yeah,
Yep.
This is a building code.
It would be really interesting to understand the rationale behind the exceptions. And I know, Chuck, you already spoke to that, but I'm just really curious about it. Because I'm just trying to think through the different mechanical configurations and how the roof area gets absorbed, but I'm not able to draw the logic. I do think this is one that we need to ask John about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just for even the format of these meetings, obviously it would be helpful to have Noresco here. That's not That's not a debated opinion. I think just to have the person who wrote it here, it comes down to that this is out of their scope of work. So we need to address that with them. And I think there's opportunities to get them here, but for probably a limited amount of hearing or these types of hearings.
Yeah, because it seems like exception 1 and 2 could almost be more of a based on total area of the roof.
Versus-
Obviously, a tall, skinny building is going to have limited roof area, but if there's, you know, a very large building that takes up a city block, then there's going to be more area to utilize. But yeah, I'm trying to formulate the right way to say that.
Well, unless that building is a residential building with units associated with each living unit,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then that mechanical absorbs the entire roof, are we trying to push people not to do that anymore? Because otherwise, that's a conflict.
No, absolutely. And moving towards electrification, those condensing units for heat pumps are going to be larger. So we'll definitely be taking a lot of roof area.
Yeah, I'm struggling because I don't have enough of an all-encompassing understanding of the different options. I have a limited understanding of the different options for mechanical and how they would land on some of these different project uses. And I'm struggling to figure out what the fair requirement is here, and how we differentiate amongst exceptions and who gets what exception.
No, I agree. And because I know in high-rise buildings, when you get smoke control exhaust, pressurization fans, getting even clearances between those pieces of equipment is a real challenge. And so I understand having an exception for these high-rise buildings, but and then other required areas of the building, like are green roofs, is there an area of green roof that's still required, or is the solar allowed to offset the area required there on some of these buildings?
So that's an interesting question, because a vegetated roof and photovoltaics tend to be complementary. So, but if an owner was going to spend only a certain amount of money, do we have an opinion on, well, we're going to require them to do photovoltaics, and as a result, they won't do the vegetated roof that they otherwise might have done? Like, have we created that scenario? And is that something that we're okay with or not okay with?
That's a good question. And I don't know what the limits of each are and how they would integrate.
I mean, I guess the thing is that since it's just a solar ready zone, a vegetated roof wouldn't interfere with them meeting the requirements of this provision, which is just that it's solar ready, because the vegetated roof is solar ready. Like, that zone can be used for solar in the future. So maybe that conflict doesn't exist when we're just talking solar ready and not actually talking installation of the PVs. Not as
Yeah.
complicated.
That makes a lot of sense, Christy. Then we're not asking a project to potentially choose, because we're not asking them to put PVs on this
Right.
or in this proposal. So
Yeah. Okay.
I think we need, yeah, we definitely need to talk to John about this. I've just been looking through comparing codes and what we enforce now, because we adopted Appendix, I think I think it's CB in 2021, and they have, language. It's not as detailed as what he's showing here, but it has language on requirements, and it's a little bit odd because the requirement in 2021 says buildings that are 5 stories or less, and then John gets into, non-residential 4 or more, which I think is, it doesn't include as many buildings when you're only considering 4. I get the high rise, I guess, at a certain height, like Chuck was saying, there's equipment considerations and maybe it's not possible. But this language in general for his amendments are very different than what's in the IECC. There's a proposal from Robbie later on today that basically is trying to move the appendix into the base code. And he's basically just taking language out of the appendix, I think it's RB, and trying to get it into the code with very few revisions to it. So I'd be curious to know where John's getting his language, because it's very different than what's in the model code.
And Alan, which appendix is that?
That's Appendix CB in commercial, and I think in residential it's Appendix RB. I think our practice is for other topics has been to accept the appendix and then amend it. And I think both John and Robbie are trying to move it into the code, which I guess that's an okay strategy. But when we adopt appendixes, we did this for tall wood structures. We did it because we're moving forward what was in 21 into 18, knowing that it was going to appear as part of the base code in 20 or in 18 or in 21. I'm sorry. And so at that point we can just drop the appendix because it's into the code now. But maybe for solar ready, since it's been an appendix now for 2 code cycles, maybe we're just trying to get it in there, because it could be the same thing like we were talking about policies. I don't know how many people look at the appendixes that we adopt. Like, oh, they look through it and then they don't know about it. And I think residential does a better job because I think it's included in their code, the energy portions. But commercial, I get questions all the time. It's like, oh, what are the requirements for solar ready? I'm like, well, it's in the appendix of the amendments. And so it gets challenging.
Alan, does the appendix seem more or less restrictive from your gut reaction to this proposal?
Well, yeah, just based on height, it's requiring 5 stories or less. And he's going, well, let's see, what does it say really here? He's exempting buildings 4 stories, 4 or more.
Mm-hmm.
So here it really says, the base code was going to say you can include 5-story buildings, where he's saying at 4 you can cut it off. And I think his reasoning kind of supports that he made a reference to some place in California, how it works. And I'm wondering if 5 stories is better for us here. I don't know.
I don't know. This appendix, just looking at it now, it's 5-story, which is, so, I mean, John has 2. He has the 4 stories or more, and then the 7 stories are more for residential buildings. And the appendix doesn't distinguish. It just is 5 stories. So it's simpler, which is always better when it comes to enforcement. And then it has some exceptions where, where it talks about Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a pretty well written section. I'd be interested to know why John proposed this instead of using the appendix.
So maybe we table this one until we can talk with John, because John has such a high degree of familiarity with the California codes and none of us do. trying to decipher the explanation is going to be out of reach for us, where he's going to be able to tell us what his rationale was.
Agreed.
I think we can check in with John on that. I'm going to jump to the next one, which is 88. There's a Denver Green Code proposal. So my understanding of this one is that this one would require manual D calculations to accommodate a MERV 13 filter. So requiring those calculations rather than just sizing the equipment with manual S or J. But Chuck, I'm sure you have a more thorough understanding of the implications on this.
Well, so first off, it appears this is a residential proposal, and it was in the commercial section. So I just wanted to clarify that the intent was for this to be residential. Because I think chapter 4 of the Green Code is residential. So just the way they
Yes.
were categorized in the email, it was listed as a commercial. So assuming this is residential, section R403.7 of the Energy Code already requires the use of, or the sizing to be based on ACA Manual J and S. So because it looks like Robbie pretty much took the section, I think it was Robbie. Yeah, Robbie took the section R403.7 out of the IECC and has now essentially moved it to the Denver Green Code, and then added the underlined section and deleted the final sentence. So I questioned the needed, some of this needed language. So I guess in summary, ACA Manual J and S are already required in the base IECC, and then section Chapter 16 of the IRC requires the use of ACA Manual D to size ducts. So ACA Manual J and S are already required in the base code. So I don't see the need to reiterate that here. I think we could just simplify this whole section and just require a MERV 13 filtration to be provided. And then all three of those other things are already required elsewhere in code.
And you said chapter 16 and the IRC requires manual D.
Yeah, it's the first section, the first sentence. Yeah, so M1601.1.
Yeah.
Although that's the 2018 code, so it might be different in 2021. So, but yeah, that it's not. It probably won't change in the 2021. And Robbie may be adding all this to kind of get everything in one place. I just always question reiterating other code requirements multiple places, because then when they get updated or modified, they need to be modified or updated in multiple places.
Can I read some? Yeah, I mean, he's talking about the benefits, but not necessarily the reason behind his proposal being to kind of consolidate the requirements.
And then he deleted the last sentence requiring that an efficiency equal to or greater than the minimum required by federal law for the geographic location where the equipment is installed. I mean, that's a preemption, that's code minimum. And it's also in the base code of R403.7. So I have hesitation specifically deleting that requirement, especially when it is just part of the base code. So I think this whole section could be simplified and just requiring MERV 13 filtration.
I mean, removing basically this whole portion and just requiring MERV 13 filter, and then maybe keeping the newer replacement heating and cooling system, or cooling. I wonder if we need that part.
No, that's in base code as well. So I think
Oh, okay.
all 401.7 could just be simplified in saying MERV 13 filtration is required. Maybe there's a better way of saying that.
So I feel
Well, and it would be a minimum. So just like a minimum of MERV 13 filtration shall be installed.
Yep.
and I feel like we should change the title. To just equipment filtration.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's the Denver Green Code or the base Green Code requires a minimum of, I think it's MERV 8. And so maybe just find that section where it's MERV 8 and modify it to require MERV 13 would be a simpler way of doing it, of accomplishing this. But chapter 4 in the IGC, in the International Green Code, is a reserve chapter, which I thought was interesting. Is that?
So the IGCC is written for commercial buildings only. We added residential in 2019. So that's why we took chapter 4.
Okay. So then, yeah, then we do need to be specific on the language there. Yeah. The ACCA manual J, S, and D are already required elsewhere in the code, so I think we can get rid of that. And they'll be required to be sized on MERV 13 if they're using the green, or if they're the green building code. And then this last sentence, I don't take issue with it. I think it's a good idea.
Sorry, Chuck, did you mean this last sentence we keep it in? Is that?
Oh, no, I was talking the 401.7.1, the system cleaning.
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved if that happened in my home when I moved in. Like, it's just a good idea. So I feel like this is the Denver Green Code's a good place for that. Unless, like, because it's not required anywhere else, right? This isn't a duplicate.
Well, yeah, I'd have to go through IRC to verify it, but I don't think it is. I think it's just one of those things that's assumed that good practice is taken. But
So I don't think that the Denver Green Code, that the 2019 Denver Green Code actually requires MERV 8. I just did a search for
Yeah.
MERV and it pulled up 4 locations, but there is reference to MERV 8 in one of the electives where it's under an exception. It's a particulate matter. The following requirements shall apply in all buildings with exceptions. And then there are some that have MERV 8 filtration that are accepted. But I'm not finding anything in here in chapter 4 or doing a search for MERV that tells me that we have to hit any specific MERV rating.
interesting. So in the 2018 base green code. Section 801.3.1.3 requires MERV 8 for indoor
Well,
environment.
What you mean?
so does it though? Because it's 801.3.1.3. That's where I was
Mm.
sitting, but that's where those are exceptions to the requirement for filtration for, the following requirements shall apply in all buildings, exceptions in healthcare facilities. Oh, I see. Okay. The exception is the healthcare facility, and then it's those other things. Sorry, I wasn't reading that correctly.
No, that's poorly displayed. I've not seen that written that way, but yeah, I think the exceptions only go to A, and then A requires 1, 2, or 3.
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
So do we want to modify that location or move with this proposal?
I think we would want to modify that location because that applies to all projects. But then it's a question. The proposal was for residential. Do we want to modify it for just residential, or do we want it to apply to everything?
Ideally, apply to everything, but I guess the check on which calculations would be required on the commercial side would be helpful, since we kind of already nailed down what's already required from the residential side.
I'm looking at base green code 2018. So that section we were just talking about, 801.3.1.3. So there's 1, 2, and 3, and number 3 is particulate matter smaller than 2.5 micrometers. And in that section, it says, such filters or air cleaners shall have a MERV of not less than 13 when rated in accordance with ASHRAE 52.2. So I think it may already be a requirement in the green code, in the base green code, but maybe we need to have it added to our Denver green code. Pull that base code language over.
That's
But
in the
yeah.
Denver Green Code. I'm looking at the 2019 Denver Green Code, and that number 3 exception is in there too.
Yep.
So then why do we have this? I'm just, something's not connecting in my brain here. There are 3 things that projects have to comply with. One is a MERV 8, one is a MERV 13. But the project has to comply with all 3 to meet the elective. So why would we have that? I don't get it.
Is
Okay.
the elective different than, is 8 for the mandatory and 13 is the elective?
No,
They're all on the
not
same
the way that
level.
it's, yeah.
Well, they talk about different particulate size, and I think that's interesting too, because
801.3.1.3, is that what I heard?
It just, I'm something doesn't make sense to me here, because is it the location of the filter?
all right, give me a sec. I'm going to the Denver green code. I want to see what we have in there. Come on.
It's just so weird because there's particulate matter smaller than 10 PM10. Particulate matter filters or air cleaners shall be provided in accordance with standard 62.1 section 6211 with the following modification. Such filters or air cleaners shall have a MERV of not less than 8 when rated in accordance with ASHRAE standard 52.2. And then number 3, particulate matter smaller than 2.5, PM 2.5. And then it's the same statement exactly copy pasted, except that the requirement is for MERV 13 rather than 8. And those are both under section heading 801.313, filtration and air cleaner requirements, that states particulate matter, the following requirements shall apply in all buildings. It's not you pick one of the three or two of the three, it's the three requirements apply.
Yeah.
Very weird.
Can you all see my screen? I pulled it up here. I'm not sure if it's visible.
Yes.
Okay. Um, you don't choose your particulate matter.
Exactly. And you don't filter for different particulates in different places.
Yeah.
Oh,
So would we, for this section, just cross out 2? And then
And-
that's the proposal, and then maybe adding the cleaning aspect into it.
So, Chuck, does that section, that wetted surfaces piece, would those filters be in a different place?
no, because I mean, it's talking about the air going over the cooling coils. So I mean, that's typically where filters are, is it's ahead of your cooling coils. So as your cooling coils don't collect a bunch of dust and become ineffective.
So we're saying that you only need wetted surfaces if you're serving an occupiable space. So say I'm the self-storage thing down the road, I don't have to do it. But I would imagine, I'm just going to argue that, does the self-storage thing need any of these? The self-storage, like, none of these would apply to a non-occupied space. So why the first one references occupiable space and the next two don't, doesn't make sense to me. What am I missing?
Well, maybe they're, my guess is they're probably trying to write an exception there for like a walk-in cooler, where you have a fan coil just recirculating the air within the walk-in cooler. Because the need for filtration there is not as much.
Okay.
62.1.
And just to say it, this was taken direct, like the 2021 IGCC has this exact language. So we didn't make this up and go off the rails on our own.
No.
We just left it alone.
Is there commentary to the IGCC?
There is not, that I'm aware of, because I asked for it and I wasn't given it, which means typically that it doesn't exist. You know, and interestingly, the one difference that I'm seeing in the 2021 is that the exceptions thing is put at the bottom instead of the top. It's put after the 3 things that you have to do. So going back, I mean, I think the basic question here is our Denver Green Code currently already requiring MERV 13? So maybe we don't even need to amend anything. And then from there, if we think that it's not for some reason, what is it requiring? Because to me, the way that I read our Denver Green Code today, it requires MERV 13
It
for
appears
all
to,
buildings.
it
Sorry.
appears to require MERV 13 for me as well.
Okay. So I'm not sure what was being, so it seems like this proposal is not changing anything, and maybe it just goes away.
I'm just wondering if we can incorporate the system cleaning into the current 801 section, if that makes sense for that to go there.
Well, then we, because I think a system cleaning in like a high-rise building is a lot more challenging. So but I remember reading somewhere, and I don't know if it's in the Green Code or not, where they talk about how to install and then seal the HVAC system after it's been installed to prevent construction debris from entering.
So that it might not even need the cleaning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this requirement is saying it's only for those governed by IRC. So it
Yeah.
excludes all of our commercial buildings.
Yeah. So I'm okay putting it in chapter 8.
Okay.
This section here.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was just saying, I feel like we're at a good place with this one. We're moving one into the other, and the other existing section already accounts for what this proposal was.
I agree. I was just going to say, it seems like we had pretty perfect timing on this one. Because it is 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for this first offline session hearing. We'll do our best to get Johnny here for the next one to see how we can work with Noresco to bring them in. We're trying not to bring Noresco in. The ones that are submitted by Robbie as public proposals will be looked at differently than the ones submitted on behalf of the city. So we're trying to separate those. But we'll do our best to make sure the right people are here for these conversations moving forward. So thank you all.
Hey, Christy, do you have a commentary for the Green Code, the 2018 Green Code?
No, and I don't think one was created. And I can do a search now, but I never had, I was not given a 2018 Green Code. That was something I bought myself. So, but I don't think a commentary existed.
And I know most of the language is just out of, what is it, ASHRAE 183. It'd be interesting to see if we can find a commentary on ASHRAE 183 to verify this MERV 13. But to me, it looks like it requires MERV 13. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I would agree. And yeah, I just searched the ICC site, and there's only an IGCC, not a commentary. Okay.
So I feel like, sorry, I know we're 2 minutes over. I feel like this one is ready to send back to Noresco. That's the one that I would send today. The others that we can revisit. Just wanted to clarify that.
Agreed.
Cool.
Well,
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, see everyone.